This morning, I want to talk to you about two such important things. One is community and one is belonging. I want to start with community. And Melinda, what you said spontaneously exactly fits with my theme this morning about how miraculous it is that we are a community. Some of us have never met in person. Some of us may be here today for the very first time. Some of us don't know focusing. Some of us are long-term focusing people and teachers. And we are an organismic whole. We are a system. We are an us. And we've been meeting since, I think, early April. Is it, Melinda?
I think so. Very close.
Yeah, or sometime in April. I'll have to look back and see. And every week we have come together to, as we say, hold space, but it's so much more than holding space, or holding space is so much more than what we think it is. We've come together to co-create a kind of inspiration, a kind of support, a kind of introspection, a kind of connection, a way of being a community. And it's co-created each time anew, and there is a sense of its ongoingness, opening out, it's maturing. This is a very different community than it was in April or May or June, or maybe even last week. There's something amazing about that. How we did that. And I want to thank Isabel, who isn't here right now, for all of the work she did to help Melinda and I co-create this, and all that she contributed to the first phase of this journey of community. You know, when you start a group, a connectedness, you are giving birth to an entity. To entity is a bad word there. To an organism, to a life. There is a life of this community that we have all added to, and that we are adding to and creating in this very moment, in the way that you're listening, in the way you're sitting, in the way you're being. Your energy is an essential part of this organismic life. And I'm so grateful for that. Originally, I think it was my idea, and it just came. You know, it was like I needed something, and it came that that this is what I needed. And then all of us jumped in. Melinda jumped in, and Isabel, and all of us. Just taking that in for a minute. Each community has its own felt sense, its own soul, its own being. And we sort of shepherd it and are shepherded by it each week. I have very much been interested in nonlinear dynamic systems theory, or complexity theory, as it impacts on psychotherapy. And if any of you are interested in reading that, I'll send you a little article about it by Bill Coburn, who is studying what all of the systems in the universe, the grand systems of stars and the microsystems, and how systems work. And a system that's a healthy system, that's a long-lasting system, is a system that's open and self-regulating. And I think that describes our community here. Open and self-regulating. And there's this idea that a healthy system hovers over this tipping point between chaos and rigidity. We need to have enough flexibility, spontaneity, newness, perturbations that disrupt us and challenge us in order to keep life. And we need to, on the other side, we need to have enough stability, enough ritual, enough continuity to keep us on track. Track isn't a good, it's not a rigid track. To keep us in the flow of beginning. So that tipping point is that point that has enough spontaneity and enough predictability, and sort of hovers around there. It may go a little over to the spontaneous side, and then it will go over to maybe a little bit too much ritual. And the systems that that don't work are systems that either become too chaotic or become too rigid. And when I think of our community, it feels to me like we've done a very good job there with our ritual way of being and the spontaneous flow of our meetings, and the speakers we've introduced, and the way that we spontaneously allow each of the speakers to do it their way, and yet we have this way of coming together that's characteristically us, that we've just developed together. Was nobody's particular idea. So let's take a breath, just taking in us, this big us that we are, this big open us. And the other word that I want to introduce, that I think I talked to you about once before, is belonging. What an amazing word that is, a big, big word. Belonging is what gives us a sense of well-being, a sense of meaning, a sense of home. To belong is so important that we may bend ourselves into pretzels or pay with our souls at times to belong. Bernie Brancheft has this idea of what he calls systems of pathological accommodation. You might not like that language. There's something I like about it. And we all know about systems of pathological accommodation. Sometimes we have that in our families. Sometimes we have it in our culture. It's the systems in which we have to be a certain way in order to belong. And we have to give up an essential part of ourselves in order to belong. And what Bernie Branchev says is that sometimes these structures of pathological accommodation happen before we speak, before we have real thoughts. Very, very early age, we can accommodate to our families, to our culture, and give up parts of ourselves in order to belong. That kind of belonging is a kind of pseudo belonging that deadens us. The kind of belonging that enlivens us is the kind of belonging not where you can do anything you want, but where you can be who you are. The belonging in which you don't have to give up essential parts of yourself. You may have to navigate them. You may have to negotiate, but you don't have to leave out essential parts of yourself to belong. And when we have given up essential parts of ourselves to belong, with help from others, with larger systems that impact on us, we may have an awakening. And in that awakening, sometimes this happens with teenagers, it's like, hell no, I'm not going to be like that. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to play that role. It may happen with movements like Black Lives Matter and the women's liberation movement and the gay liberation movement, and movements that that question ageism, and movements in which people aren't considered handicapped but differently abled. Kinds of movements where people say, no, I belong. All of me belongs. Belonging isn't something that somebody gives you, although we do give it to each other all the time. But we don't want to wait around for somebody to give it to us. Belonging is something that we claim, that we assume. And I think that's what true faith is assuming belonging. It's an inalienable right to belong. And when we assume that belonging, that is gives us courage and strength and lightness. It gives us responsibility, that ability to respond. It gives us creativity. Brother David, who I've quoted before, says that love is a yes to belonging. And that assuming belonging is saying, yes, yes, I belong. We all belong. That yes to belonging is first, maybe, and maybe it isn't first. I'll have to ask you people about that. A belonging to myself. Those Bernie Branchev people who've given up essential parts of themselves almost at birth don't have the feeling, or those parts of us don't have the feeling that we belong to ourselves. We belong to ourselves. We belong to our families, our cultures, our so many, 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 many systems that we belong to. And we're going to reflect on that today. to say yes to that belonging and to assume it. Let's just see here what the word belonging brings for you. True belonging as a place that I can be at home, that I can be myself, that I can be in connection in a living way rather than a deadened way. Does anybody have any words or images that come with the word belonging? We aren't going to take a lot of time here, but I'd love to hear from you what that word brings.
Please unmute yourself, because I needed to mute everybody so there was no background noise.
For me, it brings up snuggling in, not necessarily in a physical way, but just that feeling of comfort and a holding love.
A holding love. Yes. Anybody else?
Lynn, can you tell us the name of the psychologist again? Bernie?
Brancheft. He wrote Systems of Pathological Accommodation.
Okay. Thank you.
A mouthful, but it's an important concept.
Well, I just think of safety, complete safety, which is such a huge thing to feel.
Yes.
Yeah.
And safety, it's like safety is safe enough to be on the edge of our comfort zone, safe enough to take risks, safe enough to be right on that edge where it feels a little precarious, but we know that there's a bigger holding that's going to catch us there. It's not the kind of safety where we're complacent or I don't know, just snuggled in, watching the kind of TV that turns your brain into mush, but you really like it at times. That kind of comfort. It's, I think the true belonging stretches beyond that. But of course, we need those evenings too sometimes.
Mary McGuire and Janet Klein use the word safely uncomfortable. And I love that, like,
yes,
it's that edge of safety,
right,
not unsafe, but safely.
Right, that's right.
Yeah.
Some psychoanalyst that I can't remember who it is talks about being safe enough, but not too safe. And there's a kind of too safe. And that might bring me to my next point, which is that that groups under stress tend to want to be tribal, to close the walls around them to feel safe. I think of a community as something that's open. It's not particular members of a community. It's a community is an open system. A group can be a closed system. And so I'm always wanting to keep our Help the Helpers a community, not a group. A group, there are members, and then there are those that don't belong. They're outside the group. A community can be an open system where anyone can belong. And under stress, we become less able to deal with the uncomfortable comfortable. And we want to close in and say, we are us and we're not like them. And we do that in so many ways that we don't even know that we're doing it.
Mhm.
Language is one such important way. We should have one Help the Helpers group about language. Do you notice how language defines who belongs? And that language that crosses boundaries, fresh language, the language, felt sense language, brings us alive because it breaks down some of the assumptions and the walls that we have. Like Krista Tippett talks about how she loves the word muscular, that she would use the word love only if she says muscular love. Somehow that stood out in my mind in reading Krista Tippett's Becoming Wise, which I totally recommend that book for holiday reading. But that word muscular love, or the way Jackie Lewis talked about revolutionary love, it sort of wakes you up because it's like, oh, what's that? And all of us know that in our focusing. But do we recognize how words can also keep people out? And it's well known that a certain way of speaking or an accent or a use of language defines people in terms of their state of belonging and often their class. And I had loved that movie about My Fair Lady when they teach this street girl how to speak the Queen's English, and everybody thinks of her so completely differently. I mean, language, and we don't want to all just learn to speak in a way that people will respect us. We want that respect to be there for all of our natural languages. But even words like, say, the words white privilege, that word, that phrase is meant to open things up and to challenge us. And it does that. But for some people, it's like, oh, I'm not welcome. It keeps people out. And we have to be so aware of all of our ways of using language, that our language is giving a message of openness. So not that we aren't going to say, some of us who are very interested in the concepts of white privilege, we're not going to say, wow, look at the differences in how people of color and people who are white are treated in this world. We're not going to say that, but we might not, to certain people, use that particular phrase that's going to define who's in and who's out. I'm just using that as a sort of example that came to me in the moment. But there's also academic language that keeps people out. In my field of psychoanalysis, it was actually admitted that that the psychoanalytic writing needs to be in a certain language, a certain lexicon, because it's a dialogue of scholars. And
I'm having trouble connecting to the internet. Take a look at the help section in your Alexa app.
I don't know what, okay, sorry. It was actually admitted by some of the forefathers of psychoanalysis that language was meant to keep people out who weren't scholars. They won't know what we're talking about. So language can bring people in or keep people out, can define who we belong with and who we don't belong with. I want to say also that community, that belonging is not um, is not a demand to like everybody, to agree with everybody, to approve of everybody. Just like the community of ourselves, our inner democracy, there may be parts of ourselves that we don't like at times, or we don't agree with, or we don't approve of, but we belong to ourselves. And as communities, we belong with each other. We belong with the people that we don't like, we don't approve of, we don't agree with. There can be something that transcends that, which I think we've discussed that Rumi poem about there's a field beyond right and wrong. I'll meet you there. That beautiful poem that talks about the humanness of belonging that transcends the liking and not liking, agreeing and disagreeing. And that's what keeps our communities stimulated and constantly refreshing and renewing those systems that are self-generating, is the challenge of the differences. A community is a community of differences, and we are people, each individual that has different parts of us, or if we don't like the language of parts, different voices within us. So I'd like us to focus this morning on the challenge of broadening our horizons of belonging. Going to those edges where we are challenged in our belonging, assuming belonging, and sort of recognizing the essential nature that we are made of belonging. That's what we are, is this belonging. So if you have a pencil and a paper, you might want to pick that up. Some people are very oriented toward writing and other people aren't. But if you have a pen and paper and you want to have that near you, I'm going to lead you in a little experience here of first just being with that essential nature of belonging. That inalienable right of belonging. Belonging in such a way that you can be yourself, even if you can't always at all times do whatever you want. Some things have to be navigated and negotiated, but our basic being, who we are, all the parts of ourselves, belong. Then I'd like you to think about or write down all of the communities that you belong in, how you identify as an interconnected human. This community, maybe your family, maybe your your partner, that there's a belonging partnership, or your children, or your pets. Oh, pets are wonderful, wonderful yes to belonging. Pets don't question that they belong to you and that you belong to them. Maybe there's a community, a faith community that you belong, that you have a feeling of belonging. Maybe your country, your culture, your town, your neighborhood, your philosophy. Maybe being a focuser is an important part of your communal identity. Being a woman or a man, being a woman of color, being a young person or an old person, belong in a community of elders or of young people. Just as it comes to you, write down or think about all of these communities of belonging. Where you would want to feel more belonging than you feel. Perhaps in your family, you feel marginalized or taken for granted or something, and you want to feel a stronger sense of claiming your belonging. Your you-ness. We have to have an I-ness, a you-ness, in order to have an alive us-ness. See if there's a felt sense of the communities that you are most identified with. And if they have different felt senses, this Help for Helpers community may have a different felt sense than the larger community of the whole focusing world or your neighborhood community. Anything that comes about community and about belonging, let's give that a moment, and then we're going to come back together. I see some are still, it's a lot that I gave you, wasn't it, in this little attunement, a lot to think about. But you could just mark it down to come back to later. Jean always said, I just want you to know that spot so you can return to it. Beth was sort of saying that too, you know, that we can return to what she presented, to know that spot.